Hello, everyone. This is Rabbi Jeff Sachs again, resuming our study of Halakhic Man. Apologies that we did not meet last week. 2 weeks ago we did meet, and I was broadcasting from New York. When we last met, those of you that follow along the archives might not notice that there's a gap in the broadcast schedule. When we last met, we were examining Cognitive Man, the scientist, Cognitive Man's approach to reality. Now, by reality, again, we're talking about the created world. We should not confuse discussions of this world as opposed to Olam Haba, the next world, the eschatological vision. Eschatology is a fancy word that means the messianic era, the end of time, whatever our conception of what will be when we shuffle off this mortal coil into the next world, the redeemed world, the resurrected world, a complex and not chad mashma'i, not unanimous, we understood, not unanimously understood topic amongst Jewish interpreters. A number of years ago, we spent some time looking at the Rambam's point of view on that. I'm sorry, 1 second. Okay, how's the sound now? Is that better? Does it sound clear? Please let me know. But reality, as opposed to reality meaning this world, the world that we occupy, hold on a second, let me check the testing. Ezra, how's that now? Is that clear? Okay. Maybe I'll just start again. We can lop off the bad part from the archives. Hello again, this is Jeff Sachs from Untitled WebYeshiva, and we are resuming our study of Halakhic Man, looking at Halakhic Man's approach to reality. In our last session, which was 2 weeks ago, broadcast from New York, we looked at Cognitive Man, the scientist's approach to reality. And the week before that, in our archives, you'll find the discussion of Homo religiosus, the religious man's approach to reality. Now, the approach to reality and the approach to what I'm calling this world, the physical world, the planet that we occupy, but not just the planet, because we're also discussing the entirety of the cosmos, the world which is governed by the laws of nature, the universe that is governed by the laws of nature as commonly understood, is not meant to be opposed to Olam Haba, the world to come. And as I mentioned a moment ago before we got going, Olam Haba, not a universally unanimous understanding of exactly what that is, not just because, as the Rambam points out, our ability to understand what the world to come is highly speculative, like the manner in which a fish is unable to imagine life on dry land, so too our ability to fully fathom what that world will be like is limited. But because there isn't consensus even amongst Jewish interpretations of how that will work and what that will be, the resurrected world, the messianic world, the redeemed world, etc. We're talking and comparing the reality of the physical world that we occupy, the world of nature that we occupy, as opposed to a transcendent realm, meaning the realm of the spirit, the realm that exists now, certainly according to Homo religiosus, and it may exist just cognitive man is oblivious to it, or is ignorant of it, or is willfully ignoring it. And those were the discussions in the previous two sessions. I remind you, and again, a few people actually mentioned that they found this chart to be quite handy. The discussion is really between the material world versus the spiritual world. Cognitive man, the scientist who we discussed last week, is oblivious to the realm of the spirit, and he is only occupied with exploring the material world. Homo religiosus can't be, the religious man can't be a mere flip image of cognitive man, because you cannot, in fact, it's not possible to deny that we live in a physical created world. Slap the seat you're sitting on. It's obviously not transcendent. It was bought in IKEA, and there's nothing less transcendent than IKEA. He admits, obviously, that we do live in a material world, but yet he aims to escape it and to literally transcend. That's the notion of the transcendental. And Halakhic Man, as we're about to see, makes a different movement. And again, this was just a handy heuristic to help organize our thinking. But now we're really going to get into perhaps among the most well-known passages in the Halakhic Man. And this relates in section 1, part 6, starting on page 19 in the English language edition. Halakhic Man's approach to reality. When he approaches reality, he comes with his Torah, given to him from Sinai, in hand. He orients himself to the world by means of fixed statutes and firm principles. An entire corpus of precepts and laws guide him along the path leading to existence. In short, what the Rav is saying is that Halakhic Man interprets the cosmos, the world that we occupy, reality, through the prism of halakha. Interestingly, he does not use that term in these opening 2 or 3 sentences. And I've told you many times that halakha has this dual meaning of, kind of more garden variety meaning specific law. But halakha with a capital H, the halakha in the meaning of the title Halakhic Man, is halakha is a synonym for the system writ large. But here he refers to it as Torah, the Torah given from Sinai. And again, for the halachist, the Torah given from Sinai is not merely the Chumash, but the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the uninterrupted, ongoing interpretive tradition principally embodied in the Talmud, although not exclusively so. So whenever we talk about Torah, we're not merely talking to that book that you can point on the shelf, or that holy scroll that's kept in the ark in the synagogue. We're talking about the Torah HaKtuvah v'Hamesura, in that felicitous phrase. The written and interpreted and transmitted Torah. And that serves as the framework through which Halakhic Man evaluates the world in which he lives. Last week we talked about, just by way of example, and I mean, you'll see that I, influenced by some of my own teachers, I don't forego the good metaphor or comparison even to popular culture when it will serve the purposes of helping explicate an otherwise thorny concept that we need to understand in studying Torah. I don't equate Star Trek with studying Torah, but even Star Trek, as I tried to demonstrate last week. I was pleased by all the very many affirmative shout-outs that I got to that during the week. Can help us organize our thinking or clarify our thinking. But then I also sent out that clip from that film about Temple Grandin, that autistic woman, who who's so revolutionized animal care and husbandry in the United States, and the way that the filmmakers there, portrayed how she views the world based upon a priori, lechatchila, a predetermined template for viewing the world. Afterwards, it struck me that film, A Beautiful Mind, about what was his name? Someone can Google it. About the mathematician, the economist, really, who won the Nobel, even though he suffered from schizophrenia. That film that was made a few years ago. The filmmakers there similarly were able to depict how the mathematician views the world. That the equations, not only do we see the quantum equations, as if it were a cartoon, kind of bubbling up from his head, but how they're kind of superimposed on the reality around you. There's a scene that takes place, as I recall, in a bar, and they're playing John Nash. Thank you, Peter. And the film was A Beautiful Mind, and I'm sure on YouTube you can find a clip that demonstrates this as well. But a similar idea of how film can portray this, and we're of course, even though there was this documentary about Rabbi Soloveitchik called The Lonely Man of Faith, it does not attempt to actually demonstrate for us how the world looks to the Halakhic man. But as we go through this chapter now, imagine you're the filmmaker. And this would be, wouldn't this be an interesting assignment? If this were the kind of class where we could give assignments, to task the students with making a short, 2 or 3 minute YouTube clip for how the Halakhic man, sees, looking at the world through the Halakhic man's glasses. He orients himself to the world by means of fixed statutes and firm principles. An entire corpus of precepts and laws guides him along the path leading to existence. Halakhic man, well furnished with rules, judgments, fundamental principles, draws near the world with an a priori relation, lechatchila. Before he opens his eyes, before he goes out into the world, he already has an understanding of that world. He has, from the outset, lechatchila, he has an understanding, a template, as it were, by which he interprets the world. And then reality matches up with that, or it doesn't match up with that. But again, to go back to the other example I gave last week, in talking about the cognitive man, who does this through a different set of principles, through a different set of lenses, like the architect who sees the world, through the prism of his blueprint, like the musical composer who sees the music, through the prism of the musical notations, and he can hear, in quotation marks, the music in his head, as it were, by playing the score as written on paper. And to a certain degree, that's superior. It's more pure, it's more Aristotelian than actually listening to the symphony, who inevitably there's going to be some note missed by the third violinist. It's going to be executed by the conductor in a way not to the liking of the composer. Maybe they'll argue about it backstage. But there's this kind of pure, again, go back to the notion from 2 weeks ago, the Aristotelian ideal, and then the actual bitsua, the actual carrying out in the world, where you move from the realm of blueprint to building, from musical score to symphony, from the ideal halacha into the world. Halakhic man, well furnished with rules, judgments, fundamental principles, draws near the world with an a priori relation. His approach begins with an ideal creation and concludes with a real one. Again, ideal here doesn't mean preferred. Ideal here means on the realm of the abstract ideal. And real in the sense of actual physical. To whom may he be compared? And here we go. to the mathematician who fashions an ideal world and then uses it for the purpose of establishing a relationship between it and the real world, as was explained above in the discussion of, remember that long list of philosophers that have dealt with this topic. The essence of the halakha, which was received from God, consists in creating an ideal world and cognizing the relationship between that ideal world and our concrete environment in all its visible manifestations and underlying structures. There is no phenomenon, entity, or object in this concrete world which the a priori halakha, the ideal, the blueprint, does not approach with its ideal standard. When Halakhic Man comes across, and now we begin a long catalog of natural phenomena, springs and mountains and time and etc. And most people go looking out. The poet who might be closer to homo religiosus in some ways, the poet goes out and he sees the sunset and he sees the bubbling spring and he sees the mountaintop, and he interprets it through one set of glasses, not Halakhic Man. Halakhic Man interprets the natural world through the prism of the halakha. And this catalog becomes a description of the degree to which halakha, so counterintuitive, or so, no, don't say counterintuitive, so contrary to a kind of general notion of what occupies the religious mind. That the religious mind is occupied by matters of the spirit, by matters of ethics, by matters of righteousness. Yes, certainly all that. But the halakhic mind is also occupied with making an interpretation of how the world in which we occupy is used, can be utilized, can be drafted for the implementation of the halakha. It's for this reason, possibly, that Halakhic Man cannot accept homo religiosus's allergy to the physical world. Because Halakhic Man recognizes that we were created in the natural world. That part of the plan of creation was that we should occupy this world. And anything that God created was tov ma'od, was exceedingly good, as described in the first chapter of Bereshit. And it can't be that that's negative, that's something to be fled from. It must be that it is something which should be harnessed for the actualization of the spirit in the material world, calling down the transcendent, not for us to escape this world to that above, but to call down the heavens to the earth. And without going into each and every detail of the halakhic catalog that's listed here, we shall visit a few. When Halakhic Man comes across a spring bubbling quietly, he already possesses a fixed a priori relationship with this real phenomenon. The complex of laws regarding the halakhic construction of a spring for the purposes of mikvah. The spring is fit for the immersion of the zav. It may serve as mechatat. It purifies with flowing water. It does not require a fixed quantity of 40, etc., etc. For the purposes of tuma v'tahara, of impurity and purity, of one leaving the state of ritual impurity. So we know about a mikvah, right? You know, this constructed ritual bath that has certain laws, but all of those same things can be accomplished in a natural spring, even though there are certain halachot that differ. So when you look at you're taking your nature walk and you see this natural bubbling spring, And what you see is you superimpose with your X-ray halachic goggles all of those halachot from the Rambam, all of those mishnayot in mikvaot, and you see its potential as a instrument to perform a halachic function. When Halakhic Man approaches a real spring, he gazes at it and carefully examines its nature. In other words, on one hand, you can undergo halachic analysis in the abstract. And many great halachists did this for reasons that are sociologically interesting, although today, practically, much less so. One of the core areas of study for rabbinical training was shechita, ritual animal slaughter, to get kosher meat. And you can understand in the days when people were much more connected to ritual animal slaughter. If you wanted to eat a chicken in the evening, you had to slaughter one of your chickens in the morning. You had to drain it of its blood, you had to salt it, and many other cumbersome acts had to be undertaken in order to get yourself a kosher chicken. Even if you didn't raise chickens yourself, you would go to the marketplace in the morning, pick out a chicken, wait online at the shochet, at the kosher slaughterer, pay him whatever it cost. He'd take the chicken to the back, give you a dead chicken without a head, or maybe with the head in the side, for people that like that, and you'd have to go home, you'd have to clean it of its feathers. It was a whole day affair. None of us do this anymore. I mean, it could be that one of you will tell me that you raise chickens, and good for you. But besides you, none of us do this anymore. So much so that, like, most kids grow up not realizing that chicken comes from chicken. Like once, when my older kid was small, there's always that moment that like every little kid has where you realize that chicken is chicken and hamburger is cow, and there's that moment of crisis where you decide you have to be a vegetarian until you realize that would mean giving up meatballs with the spaghetti. So you learn to live with conflict. Most children go through this. So my wife gives my son like chicken. So he says, "What is this?" So she says, "It's chicken." And he said, "It comes from a fish?" So, I mean, like that is something that even just a few generations ago, to say nothing of centuries ago, would have been unimaginable. And there are some food theorists today, led by that great writer Michael Pollan, who I've mentioned a number of times in the past. I've mentioned that I've had some interesting email interactions with him. He happens to be Jewish, and he, here and there in his writings, mentions that in different ways, although doesn't seem to be terribly traditionally engaged. But Pollan has this fabulous book called The Omnivore's Dilemma, where he tries to spell out some of the different ethical trade-offs that all our modern food decisions involve. Ethical trade-offs, moral trade-offs, economic trade-offs, food that might actually be healthier for us, for me as an individual, might actually be less healthy for the planet. And food that might be healthier for the planet, if we were to say that we should all only eat that food, would condemn millions of people to starvation, particularly in Africa, because in order to produce enough food, enough grain, enough corn to sustain the population that exists on planet Earth today, you need all types of pesticides that are poisoning the planet and are creating, massive tens and hundreds of square miles in the Gulf of Mexico where no fish can live anymore because of the runoff down the Mississippi, etc., etc., etc. So he spells out some of these conflicts, and one of his things that he argues for is that You want to eat meat? Great, eat meat. He's not a vegan, but he says, you know what? You should at least see a chicken be slaughtered once in your life. In other words, this idea that we've outsourced all of that, and chicken is just something that comes in saran wrap, and the remove that we have from the animal is not necessarily such a healthy thing, because it kind of allows us to make moral decisions for ourselves and for our community and for our planet and for our health and for our economy, you know, in a kind of blind, and that's not preferable. So in halachic decision making, for whatever reason, shechita is still a main course of study in most rabbinical programs. Even though, and I had to study this matter and take examinations on it, even though I must confess, I've only once ever seen an animal shechted, and that was many years after having completed my smicha. I certainly would not be able to do it myself, and I certainly would not be able to render an actual ruling, a psak halacha, and neither could any of the people that studied shechita along with me in smicha, and it was mostly on the level of the theoretical. So you can say, okay, in all fields of study, there's some type of challenging discipline which is not actually practical. In medicine, if there are any doctors on the line, you can weigh in whether or not you actually need a biochemistry. But biochemistry is something that's studied usually or classically, curriculum may have changed, in first-year medical school. It's a very hard, complicated, complex discipline, and it may be there merely to separate, pardon the expression, the boys from the men, or the children from the grown-ups, and to be a kind of hurdle that you have to get over to move on and to weed out people that can't handle the rigors of medicinal study. So there are these famous stories of people who were rabbonim and they wrote books on the theoretical side of a halachic area, but then when actually confronted with the gizzards of a chicken, were puzzled because they didn't engage in the actual halacha ma'aseh in each and every generation. Even in our generation, where we've outsourced all of this shechita to factory farms and to corporations, and yes, these do raise problematic issues, halachic issues, moral issues, ethical issues, economic issues from time to time, and there are the occasional scandal, of course, that we know about in industrial kashrut. But we've outsourced it to experts, and the average layperson and even the average rabbi need not concern himself with this, but yet we still study it on the theoretical plane. And then when we're confronted with the actual thing, it's a little foreign to us. So here it's the opposite. So when Halakhic Man approaches a real spring, he gazes at it and carefully examines its nature. He possesses lichatchila, a priori, ideal principles and precepts which establish the character of the spring as a halachic construct. He looks at his halachic blueprint, the halachic X-ray, and he examines the spring to determine the normative law, the halacha ma'aseh. Does the real spring correspond to the requirements of the ideal halacha or not? So this kind of movement back and forth between blueprint and reality, between musical score and symphony, between X-ray and actual palpating the bones of the hand. X-ray is probably not a good example because it's not lechatchila. It doesn't exist prior to the actual bone, but you get the idea of a kind of something that exists in reality, and then something that exists in a kind of abstract picture that corresponds to that reality, an X-ray, an MRI, whatnot, and that movement back and forth between theoretical and practical, between ideal and real, that is the work of the halachist. Halakhic Man is not overly curious, and he is not particularly concerned with cognizing the spring as it is in itself, which is the task of cognitive man. Rather, he desires to coordinate the a priori concept, the ideal concept, with the a posteriori, the b'di'eved, the thing that exists in reality, phenomena. He wants to line up the blueprint and the building. Right? He wants to see how they line up. He wants to sit there in the symphony, following along in the musical score. A few years ago, I was in London and I saw a production of Macbeth. I was alone in London and I went one evening to see Macbeth. It was a modern production. It wasn't Royal Shakespeare Company. It was a modern production. It was rather odd because they were all wearing, they weren't wearing modern costumes. They were all wearing like World War II costumes, like, you know, World War II era costumes. But the dialogue itself, the dialogue the actors spoke was Shakespearean. But the sets didn't look like a medieval Scottish castle. It looked like it looked like Hitler's bunker. And interestingly, there was in the I guess what would have been the throne room in Macbeth's throne room, which looks like like a Nazi office. There was a telephone on the desk, and in the middle of one of the acts, the telephone rang, and the actor like looks at it, picks it up, and says, "No, thank you," or something like that, and hangs up. And I didn't know like what that was and why that was thrown in, if that was intentional, if it was a gag that was played on the actor, and you always hear stories like that of things that happen on the stage. I'm not sure. But there was somebody sitting next to me at the play with a copy of the play in hand, and he was following along, in his edition of the play, and here and there a line was changed, a word was changed, wasn't faithful 100% to the text of the thing. And this fellow must have been something of a purist. He didn't like the changes in the set design, and I think he wanted more of a classical production. But he kept grunting every time. Like I asked him, like, what is he grunting about? And he said, oh, they skipped the word forsooth. I want my forsooth. So that kind of like trying to line up the ideal and the actual. that is the work of the Halakhic Man. But the Halakhic Man is not concerned with the play itself, the symphony itself, the building itself. Again, my metaphors, not the Rav's. He's not concerned with the spring as a spring. He is not a member of the Sierra Society or of the Chevra L'Haganat HaTev. I mean, he may be, but that's in his role ex officio, not in his role as the Halakhic Man. When Halakhic Man looks to the western horizon and sees the fading rays of the setting sun, or to the eastern horizon and sees the first light of dawn and the glowing rays of the rising sun, he knows that this sunset or sunrise imposes upon him anew obligations and commandments. And then the Rav lists various, this is all based upon the Gemara and Megillah. As you know, there are certain mitzvot that are nighttime mitzvot, and there are certain mitzvot that are daytime mitzvot. We're coming up on Purim, that we read the Megillah at night and we read it again during the day. And then there are other mitzvot of Purim, like Matanot Le'Evyonim, gifts to the poor, Mishloach Manot, food gifts to a friend. Those are mitzvot of the day. If you give Mishloach Manot at night on Purim, you have not fulfilled your obligation. It is something that can only be done on the day of Purim. In a month from now, hard to believe, we'll be standing on the eve of Pesach. So the night of Pesach, there are many mitzvot that can only be done on the night of Pesach. Even today, when we don't have the Korban Pesach, the mitzvah min haTorah of matzah can only be performed on the night of Passover itself. The mitzvah min haTorah of Magid, of recounting the tale of the Exodus, can only be done on the night of Pesach. To contrast with the daily, twice daily ritual of Zachirat Yetziat Mitzrayim, of remembering the Exodus once a year on the night of Passover, and only the night of Passover is there an extra mitzvah, an independent mitzvah, of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, of telling it over in its great detail, not merely mentioning. It's obviously related to the daily mitzvah, but it's an expansion, and it is in fact an independent mitzvah, counted as a separate mitzvah in the 613 mitzvot. So if you want to have on the afternoon, let's say you live in a place, I know in America already you've changed the clocks. If you live in a northern climate where Passover comes in very late, I don't know, Peter, where are you again? In the North Sea. So I don't know what time Pesach starts by you, but I'm guessing it's quite late. Sunset must be quite late in the summer. What's the latest it ever gets? Oh, Peter seems to have left his desk. He'll come back. He'll listen to the archives. We'll find out. But if you live in a northern latitude, Pesach starts very late. So if you have little children, what are you? So Avram's in the Netherlands, I think. So he says, oh, here's Peter. Peter, what time is sunset where you are in the summer? Like, what's the latest sunset? In the Shetland Islands. 11:30 at night. 11:30 at night. So you want to, and even Pesach's a little earlier, but it's still probably quite late. But people that live in northern latitudes, and you can't stay out that late. So you want to do the mitzvot, you can't do it. There's certain things, even though we do have this idea of early Shabbat, that in the summer you can make Shabbat early. That's a special halacha about Shabbat. But you cannot fulfill the mitzvot of Pesach before sunset on that night because it's not yet Pesach. So, well, I don't know. They have to hurry until Chatzot. Because what time, Peter, what time does sun rise in the summer? Well, so you only have like 2 hours of nighttime in the summer. So in April, in Pesach, it's probably have a little more time. But if one wants to be careful to finish eating before Chatzot, which is this certainly is preferred. So you have to probably rush through your Seder. There were some halachic opinions that said you shouldn't live in such places because of the difficulties of the extreme northern climates. So again, you look at the sunrise, now it is time to do the daytime mitzvot. You look at the sunset, and you don't see like something beautiful from the National Geographic that you're going to post on Facebook. You see Hama'avir Yom Umevi Laila, that God is causing the earth to rotate, and with the rotation of the earth comes the passage of time. And the passage of time, go back to our conversation when we studied Kodesh and Chol, about Kedushat Hazman, right, the sanctity of time, with the setting of the sun and the rising of the sun. This corresponds to, I wouldn't say mystical ideas, because the Halakhic Man is not exactly a mystic, but halachic ideas that now it is a new day, now it is a new dawn, now I have the obligation to pray again. Now, if it happens to be Sukkot, I have the obligation to shake the lulav and etrog. If it happens to be Rosh Hashanah, now I have the obligation to blow the shofar, etc., etc., etc. And he gives this catalog of mitzvot that can either be done during the day or done during the night, and that's what we see. That's what the Halakhic Man sees when he looks at the sunrise and the sunset. It is not like if I were to tell you, we would just free associate in a Jewish context. If I were to say sunrise, sunset, so Tevya is not a halachic man. Tevya is a homo religiosus. The passage of time brings this emotional, cathartic in that sense, the painful sense of release of emotion. Right? This nostalgia in that sense of the pain of memory. Right? You see, oh, my little kid, like, how did he grow up so fast? My 17-year-old is going off and taking driving lessons. And it hurts, not just because I have to pay for them, but because, like you say, how did he grow up so fast? Sunrise, sunset. That's Tevya. That's the homo religiosus. The halachic man sees sunrise, sunset. Says sunrise, tefillin. Sunset, kriyat shema shel arvit. Matzah shel leil haseder. You can understand why the halachic man and his kind of associate, the Litvak, the kind of Lithuanian Jew, were never accused of being overly emotional, of being highly logical. The profane and the holy are dependent upon a natural cosmic phenomenon, the sun sinking below the horizon. It is not anything transcendent that creates holiness, but rather the visible reality, the regular cycle of the natural order. Halakhic man examines the sunrise and sunset, the dawn and the appearance of the stars. He gazes onto the horizon. Is the upper horizon pale, the same as the lower? That's strict halachic definitions of exactly when sunset is. When he goes out on a clear moonlit night until the deficiency of the moon is replenished, he makes a blessing upon it. Right? The Kiddush HaChodesh, saying the blessing upon the new moon, which is so replete with Kabbalistic and mystical texts and meanings, not for the halachic man. Right? It's not about, the halachic man might actually say all those texts, even though the Vilna Gaon, who was himself, of course, an exemplar of being a halachic man, the Vilna Gaon was not in favor of certain halachic texts, certain halachic prayers. Certain Kabbalistic practices which kind of crept into mainstream Judaism, even though he himself was a Kabbalist. Even though the Gra himself was a master of the Kabbalah, he objected to the mainstream ritualization of Kabbalistic practices, with certain exceptions. But as you said, whether or not the Gra, there's certain things that the people that follow the prayer customs of the Vilna Gaon do not say. Particularly, let's say, like at Slichot. In the Slichot that we say, Rosh Hashanah and Kippur time, there are all these kinds of mystical, Kabbalistic amendations and extra things that are added in, often in Aramaic, which was kind of the language of the Kabbalah, and the people that follow the practice of the Vilna Gaon skip those things. But generally speaking, you say what's in the Siddur. So the halachic man might very well say all of those things that are in the Siddur, even though they have these kinds of mystical origins. When you go out, after all, you go out on a Saturday night, you're standing out in the shul courtyard, and you're saying a blessing to the moon, you can understand why the casual observer might think that there's something odd about this, even maybe something idolatrous about this, which is why we're careful to end Kiddush HaChodesh, Kiddush Levana, with Aleinu. Aleinu is the kind of declaration against Avodah Zarah, right? It's to make it clear that what we just did should not be misconstrued as being in any way idolatrous, that we're praying to the moon, God forbid. So it could be the halachic man says the kind of normative text as written in the Siddur, but he's not having a mystical experience. He's having a halachic experience. Right? He's making this declaration about the passage of time. HaChodesh hazeh lachem, that our calendar is fixed by the lunar cycle, that the Sanhedrin was tasked with sanctifying the moon, that sets the holidays. And even today, when we no longer do it in that way as described in the Mishnah and Rosh Hashanah, even today when we have a set calendar that Chazal established in the absence of the Sanhedrin, or because of the absence of the Sanhedrin, nevertheless we still realize that these are halachic legal matters, despite the accretion of Kabbalistic notions over the centuries. He knows that it's the moon that determines the times of the months, and thus of all the Jewish seasons and festivals. And this determination must rely upon astronomical calculations. When Halakhic Man chances upon mighty mountains, he utilizes the measurements which determine Rishut HaYachid, the Teil HaMitlaket, for the purposes of building an Eruv, the Shabbat boundary that allows us to carry. I don't know about, where you live. I'm guessing Shetland Islands, you don't have an Eruv. But there's no Chabad on the Shetland Islands, is there? Someone's got to tell Chabad. There's like one place on the planet that they've overlooked. But now today in Israel, there's no place that doesn't have an Eruv. I mean, everybody has an Eruv. I mean, my kids grew up, not like being unaware that there was such a prohibition of carrying out in the public domain on Shabbat, because they had literally never spent a Shabbat anywhere, even today on the occasions that we've visited communities in the United States, never spent a Shabbat anywhere outside of a community with an Eruv. But this notion of certain natural phenomena, an Eruv need not be only these poles and strings. There's certain natural geological or geographic phenomena. The way a mountain might be, if its rise and its run are in a certain proportion to each other, that we imagine the side of the mountain might itself serve as a wall for part of the Eruv. So the halachic, without going into the details of it, the halachic man goes out and he sees a rolling hill or a mountain or a valley, the drop off of a valley, and he sees it through the blueprint of Hilchot Eruvin. Many laws are dependent upon the classification of a species of fruit or vegetable. When a fruit is growing, Halakhic Man measures the fruit, the standards of growth and ripening that it possesses, the budding stage, the early stage of ripening, formation of fruits or leaves, reaching 1/3 Havot Shlish of complete ripeness, and these are all related to the laws of when do Trumot and Masrot have to be taken. If something grows, we're coming up now on Shemitah. After this coming Rosh Hashanah, this coming fall, we start the Shemitah, the 7th year agricultural year in the 7-year cycle. So is a fruit that's growing at the onset of Rosh Hashanah, is it a fruit of Shemitah? Is it a vegetable of Shemitah? Or is it still connected to the 6th year? Is it produce of the 6th year and therefore not relevant to Shemitah? Well, it depends on whether it's a fruit or whether it's a vegetable, and it depends at what stage of ripeness it's reached in order to be counted on this side or that side of this demarcation of the calendar. And these are all botanological realia that have halachic meaning. So you go out and you see fruit on the vine, fruit on the tree that's coming into bloom, that's coming into fullness. So you have to know how to determine to the laws of mitzvot hatzluyot ba'aretz. Blood, knowing different colors of blood for ritual purity and impurity. Here specifically in terms of hilchot nidah for the marital laws, nurturing of trees and plants, again things related to mechitza and the boundaries. The Halakhic Man, I'm just skipping ahead here on page 22. Halakhic Man explores every nook and cranny of physical, biological existence. He determines the character of all of the animal functions of man: eating, sexual relations, all of the bodily necessities, by means of halachic principles and standards. The bulk of an olive, a kazayat, the bulk of a date, a kotevet, the time required to eat a half a loaf, kidei achilat pras, the time required to drink a quarter log of revit. These are all measurements. These are all measurements. You have to eat matzah. So what does it mean to eat matzah? How much matzah do you have to eat? So you have to eat matzah the size of an olive. So how big is the size of an olive? So it's true that in modern times, sometimes the train comes off the rail. And an olive was something that, certainly like in Northern Europe, people didn't know what olives were. So you can imagine that they were not clear on exactly what the volume of an olive was. But they knew what eggs were. Those Ashkenazim, they knew what eggs were. Because after all, they had cholesterol. And in order to get cholesterol, you needed to eat eggs. So they had eggs. And they knew that an egg was twice the size of an olive. So you don't need to be a super genius. And those rabbis, they were all super geniuses to know how big an olive was. So, why do we have olives that are much bigger? So these are interesting questions. If you Google this, you'll find plenty of information. It has something to do with a figure called the Nodav Yehuda, and although it goes back even before him, and how our shiurim, are the sizes that are required, are bigger, but they're all fixed in reality. All of the measurements, the halachic measurements of how much you have to eat, or how much it's forbidden to eat. In other words, if you eat just a crumb on Yom Kippur, it's forbidden. You're not allowed to eat anything on Yom Kippur unless, of course, it's a matter of life or death. You're not allowed to eat even a crumb. Is a crumb bigger than an olive? No, it's smaller than anyone's concept of an olive, even the most lenient opinion about how big an olive is. You're not allowed to eat even a crumb. But if you eat only a crumb, everyone agrees you have violated the Torah prohibition of eating on Yom Kippur. However, you have not crossed the threshold for being culpable of the death penalty. Eating on Yom Kippur is a capital offense. So these are all technical definitions, and all of the technical definitions are connected to phenomena in the natural world in the same way, by the way, that modern measurements have been standardized. We have the atomic clock, which is this kind of universal standard. But once upon a time, time reflected some kind of natural phenomena. A year still does, to a certain degree, represent the time it takes the Earth to make its trip around the sun. A month corresponds more or less to the waxing and waning of the moon. A week is different because it doesn't correspond to anything in nature and seems to, well, we'd like to think that it comes from the biblical notion of a week being 7 days, although there are other opinions on that matter as well. A day, certainly 24 hours, from the time the sun rises to the time the sun rises again. But then the different subdivisions of that into 12 and 24 hours, and then the subdivisions of that again, these were all subjective measurements of objective phenomena. A foot, what we call a foot, which has an objective measurement today, but a foot was once somehow connected to that thing at the other end of your leg. And a yard, the same thing. So the idea that measurements actually correspond to reality means you need to have a concept of reality. And this is true, and it has ramifications for all types of things, for eating, for fasting, for intercourse, for etc., etc. Again, he goes on in this rather interesting catalog. Halakha concerns itself with the normal as well as the abnormal functioning of the organism, of humanity, with the total biological functioning of the organism. The laws of menstruation, the man or woman suffering from a discharge, the kind of discharge that would have rendered you ritually impure, tameh, which had more practical ramifications in the times of the temple. The mode of determining the onset of menstruation, virginal pregnancy, the various stages in the birth process, the various physical signs that make animals or birds fit or unfit for consumption, etc., etc., etc. There is no real phenomena, meaning there is nothing in the real physical world that we occupy to which Halakhic man does not possess a fixed relationship from the outset and a clear, definitive a priori orientation. It was said of Rabbi Soloveitchik that in this regard he really did exemplify the Halakhic man, that he would be able to look at, and we discussed this quite a bit in the Lowly Man of Faith and elsewhere, to look at not phenomena in the natural, physical sense that we've been discussing, but political phenomena, economic phenomena, social phenomena, and interpret them through the prism of halakha. The halakha as being the embodiment of and the home source for the articulation of all authentic Jewish points of view. So, for example, communism. Rabbi Soloveitchik was an ardent anti-communist. This is not surprising. Most immigrants to the United States in the 20th century were ardent anti-communists, particularly those that came from countries which fell behind the Iron Curtain after World War II, as he did. But when asked why he was such an ardent anti-communist, and this actually led him to be a supporter of the war in Vietnam, which today is not considered to be such a popular view, or seemed to have been now history has not judged the war in Vietnam so favorably, but he was a supporter of the war in Vietnam, at least initially, because he interpreted it as a war against communism. Now, it's true that communism was viewed as this very anti-Jewish force, even though, of course, there were Jewish communists, but certainly Soviet communism was viewed as a very negative force for the Jews still in the Soviet Union, not only because communism was viewed as an anti-God and religion movement, which it certainly was, and presumably if you're a leading religious philosopher and thinker and leader of a religious movement in the West, that would naturally be enough to lead you to oppose communism. But when asked why he had such strong feelings about communism, he said, well, let's look in the halakha. 1/6 of Shas is Seder Nezikin, which is based upon the idea that there is such a thing as private property. The entire jurisprudential Jewish system is predicated on the idea of private property, private movable property, private landed property. This is the bread and butter of Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Basra, right? The three pillars of Seder Nezikin. Obviously, the idea of communism, the very foundational idea of communism, is in error. Now, it's true that he probably thought all of those other things as well. But when asked to express what the source for his opposition to this modern political, economic phenomena, not a natural phenomena, not a mountain, not a stream, not a lake, not a sunset, all the demonstrations he gave here, the source for his worldview is drawn out of the halakha. There's a rather well-known story about the Israeli flag. The exact details are not important, but Rabbi Herschel Schachter records them in his book Nefesh Harav. You know that certainly, I think the story takes place in the 1950s. There were rabbinic figures in the United States who were not so enamored with the modern state of Israel, and the flag of the state of Israel was as a symbol of the state. And for reasons that, again, are not important right now, Rabbi Soloveitchik was once asked to explain his attitude towards the flag of the state of Israel. And instead of interpreting it, as a kind of nationalistic symbol that all patriots identify with the flag, I think he says, in the way that the Englishman identifies with the Union Jack and the American identifies with the red, white, and blue and the stars and stripes. So the Degel Yisrael, the flag of the state of Israel, has a halachic category. Not that he means that you could look in the Shulchan Aruch and find a sif about the Degel Yisrael, but he says it has the din of the tachrichin, of the burial shrouds. You know that there's this notion that a Jew should be buried. I see that we've gone over. Let me just conclude with this anecdote, that a Jew should be buried in these ritual burial shrouds. It's an idea that goes back to the Talmud. In the United States, where this was not always popular, many Rabbonim, tried to educate their flock, and when somebody would pass away, the rabbi would be called to be involved. Sometimes the only time the family interacts with the rabbi would try to convince them that you don't bury grandma or grandpa in their finest suit or in their wedding dress. Or we have the Jewish tachrichin, these simple white burial shrouds, which is not something that the modern American was always so enamored with. The same idea of the plain pine box, in America, and here, of course, in Eretz Yisrael, we don't even use the coffin in most cases. But there's a halakha. The halakha is that if somebody is murdered, somebody's body is found, they're buried in their bloodied clothing, so that the bloodied clothing will serve as a kind of reminder, metaphorically, of course, because we don't actually get up to the Bet Din Shel Mala, the heavenly court, wearing our actual clothing. But it will serve as a metaphorical reminder that this person met a bad end and is deserving of extra mercy on high. Rabbi Soloveitchik said he remembered seeing the newsreels after the war in 1948 of the soldiers. They knew that as the truce was going to be declared after the Milchemet Atzmaut, the War of Independence in Israel, whatever inch of territory we could capture, we could push back, that would be part of the state of Israel, and whatever would be on the other side would be part of Jordan. And tragically, the old city of Jerusalem ended up being on the other side. So he said, I remember watching those boys going out and, trying to push the border further to the east and planting down the flag and being murdered on the spot, being shot down on the spot, with the flag, the kechol v'lavan, the blue and white flag of Israel in their hands. That's what the flag of Israel is. It's like those bloodied clothing that the murder victim is buried in, that serve as a reminder that great sacrifice was made and extra mercy is needed. So somebody's asked about their attitude towards the state of Israel, and you can give a kind of Zionistic spiel. You could give a jingoistic spiel. You can talk about patriotism and nationalism. But every phenomena, and again, not just the natural phenomena, although that's the context that we're talking about here in this section, Halakhic Man, the halakha, the halachic goggles that we bring, becomes the source for finding and superimposing the halachic source on the reality, on any phenomena that we're presented with. So when asked for what is the Halakhic man's attitude towards his approach to reality, it is this superimposition of halachic ideals, of halachic blueprints onto whatever presents itself in this world. The natural world, as under discussion here in this section, and we'll continue here next week, as well as any kind of phenomena, any kind of modern phenomena. That's the way in which we are meant to interpret the world around us. So we'll pick up from here. This section will take us a bit more time when we continue next week.